You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. This is where investing's made simple. I'm your host, Andy Tanner, and it's wonderful to be here. We always have timely topics here on the podcast, and this one is particularly so. If you've been to the gas station or been to the grocery store, you've seen that inflation that people talk about actually start to have an effect on your life. So today we have Jay Prag, and he is it's just marvelous. First, he's the author of the book, Microeconomic Essentials, Understanding Economics in the News. And this is a concise and mechanical introduction to microeconomics, emphasizing concepts over mathematics with real-world examples and applications. And he's been teaching at the Drucker School of Management since 1986, also taught at Harvey Mudd College, Pomona College, and Claremont McKenna College. So a lot of academic experience, wonderful awards, understands management, understands business and economics. And we're here to discuss inflation, which, a perfect topic for the day. So first of all, Jay Prag, thank you for being on the show with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And I'll go ahead and toss one little thing in. The inflation topic is probably covered a little better in my other book, same publisher, MIT Press, which is Macroeconomic Essentials. Understanding Economics in the News. So I actually have both a micro and a macro book out there. And the macro side of the economy is where the inflation is coming from, the Federal Reserve and the policies that they undertook
certainly
during COVID, et cetera.
Certainly so. Macro and micro. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because as an investor, I begin with macro in that the first thing I think a person wants to figure out is the dollar. Where is it going? Because that tide tends to rise ships or sink most ships and bring them all up at the same time. And so it's going to be a wonderful discussion. Give us just a little bit more of your background. Why did you decide to go into economics, be a teacher, and decide to be an author?
Well, I was an undergraduate many, many years ago at the University of Florida, and actually started school as a pre-med major, so you can see how far away from that I ended up. And I was taking a variety of classes. I, grew up in a small town on the eastern shore of Maryland, so college was a brand new experience for me in so many areas. And I always liked history, and I always liked math. But there wasn't much point in majoring in either one of those. There weren't a lot of jobs in those spaces directly. Then I took an economics class from a wonderful professor, a person who I've modeled my teaching after, and kind of saw a combination of history and math and then institutions in economics, and started teaching there at Florida, and went off and got my PhD at the University of Rochester, and have been very happy in the classroom ever since. I like distilling really complicated things and then presenting them in a way that people can understand them, that regular people can understand them. So, not academics.
That makes me the perfect audience because it's interesting of all, sciences, at least the little bit that I've delved in them as a student, like Newtonian physics isn't perfect, and it's been replaced by higher theories. But you still feel like if you want to throw a football well or even put a man on the moon, Newtonian physics can get you there. The study of economics is really hard to put our finger on because these human beings. I think when you're dealing with humans, I don't know how rational we are. You think we'd be predictable, but we're not always. And so it's an interesting time. So let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve. Let's go to the macro then. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. When I drive my car, there's a element of responsiveness to it. If I turn to the left, I feel the car go left. If I hit the brake, I feel it go slower, accelerator, and so forth. I feel like the Fed drives a car where it doesn't respond for a few months. In other words, they say, let's turn this way and tweak this interest rate, or let's decide to add to the balance sheet or reduce the balance sheet. And they really don't get to see immediately whether they've got it right or not. They came out, during, pre and during COVID and said, well, let's put a target of 2% on there. And then lo and behold, we start having a little bit of inflation later on. They say, well, it's transitory. It's just this, bottleneck of goods and services and supply chains, because of COVID. It's just COVID's causing a little bit. It'll get out. Now it's looking like we haven't had this much inflation in terms of percentage growth since maybe the Carter or the Reagan years. So give me your take on that idea of the Fed's ability or inability, in your opinion, to make these accurate decisions in their to fulfill their mandate.
That's a lot of questions, but let me back up your statements there a tiny bit and just brag a tiny bit. I give economic prediction speeches at the beginning of most years, going back quite a few years for various groups. I do a little local radio show and, on like that. And in January a year ago, I actually predicted that we would have, between 5 and 6% inflation for the year, and that it was entirely due to the Federal Reserve's policy response to COVID. And there was nothing transitory about it. It was nothing to do with the supply chain stuff. Mm-hmm. It had to do with the fact that the Fed had kind of picked up the mantle that they started with back during the housing crisis, where they kind of took over the entire banking system and pumped money into the system, just sort of hoping something good would happen. And I guess you could say, after the housing crisis, it did, in the sense that the economy eventually recovered. They kind of took the same approach during COVID. The government shut down, a massive percentage of the economy. They just said we weren't allowed to go do those jobs for months at a time. The Fed's response was to just flood the economy with money. The increase in the money supply, M1, during COVID was unprecedented, enormous. Yeah. You mentioned the balance sheet. They bought every government bond. They bought mortgage-backed securities. They bought $4 trillion.
They expanded the repo market, the reverse repo market.
Yeah, so they literally propped up, in their mind, the economy. My way of explaining what they were doing was, in lieu of the fact that people couldn't go out and earn income, they created artificial wealth. They bought a lot of stuff, and by translation, propped up the housing market, propped up the stock market, and created a kind of a wealth bubble, hoping the economy would then recover and they could back off, I don't mind that logic, but now they have to back off. They have to stop doing that because they've caused inflation. They've put too much money into the system, and they haven't yet even begun to stop doing that. So, the inflation was never supply shocks. It was the Fed. And, with all due respect to Jay Powell, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he calls it. So fix it. Stop buying everything, stop pumping money into the system. Until they do that, we're just going to have inflation. I mean, that's one of the oldest connections in economics. Too much money, higher prices, period.
When I really don't know the extent to which the electorate or the public globally understand the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve and have monitored it to understand how it has changed and grown. One of my nerdy, I guess, kind of a nerdy charts I look at is you can go to St. Louis Fred, the Fred, stlouisfed.com, and they have a lot of data there, and you can build your own charts. Mm-hmm. One of the charts that I'll build over time is I'll build a chart that is it's an area chart, stacked chart with 4 accounts. The first account I'll look at is they actually are the bank the Treasury uses. So if the bank writes
Correct.
a check, it comes to the U.S. Treasury. So when the Treasury sells bonds or the IRS gives them taxes, that creates an influx into that liability side of the, just like a regular bank would. The second one is the member banks, you can apply as a state bank, but you are required to be a member, and they have tons of cash, like never before in there. Then you have the reverse repo market, which I think is a fascinating idea to try to keep a floor on interest rates, because that takes care of the money market guys and the international banks that are there. And then you have the currency supply, which is currency in circulation. If people were to look at that growth, you mentioned there was a big change. You can really see it in 2008, where they began to expand their powers. They weren't in the mortgage-backed security buying business back then, and now it's commonplace. And the whole idea when Ben Bernanke decided to do this was that they would unwind it sometime. And you just look at it from maybe 2000 to 2008, it looks pretty smooth. Currency supplies expand a little bit. 2008, it's crazy what they did. But when you look at COVID, when you say they added, what did they add? $4 trillion. $4 trillion. Well, they were under $1 trillion. They're like $700-800 billion before the subprime meltdown. So why haven't we seen even more inflation? That's not like a little tweak. That's a huge, doubling and tripling as time went on of the money supply. Why not massive inflation? Why not hyperinflation?
Well, maybe the word that belongs at the end of your sentence is yet, because, they got a little lucky, if you want to put it that way, that the housing crisis exploded the banking system, right? Just absolutely blew it apart. And so the whole idea of the typical process of borrowing and lending and whatnot, which is how money gets into the system, was just messed up. And the Fed stepped in and made sure it didn't completely go away. And as you said, started buying a lot of other things, including mortgage-backed securities, which in effect means they're buying housing, right? Or at least they're buying the investments in housing. Yep. They thought that was because it worked during the housing crisis. They thought they had a new way of saving the economy. So when COVID hit, they more or less just did exactly the same thing, but bigger, but more. The way I explain the problem, and let's focus on the mortgage-backed security thing. Yeah. Everybody thinks that's okay. The Fed can go out there and prop up the housing sector, keep value in that side of the economy, and as I said, kind of maintain wealth. I actually think they created a bit of a bubble in the housing industry. If you think that's okay, would you be okay if they went out and bought Apple stock or Ford or invested in something else, which selectively helped part of the economy? That's not what the Fed's there for. They're not there to be a direct investor. Now, they're there to provide liquidity into the economy and then let the economy sort itself out.
Well,
they need to do that.
It's interesting because capitalism, and I don't know much, I never studied capitalism beyond what, an average investor would just believe free markets competition, but people fail. We don't let people fail. And it was Janet Yellen, former Fed chair, has said, we'd love to buy equities. In fact, we should be like Japan. We should be able to buy equities. And when I think about that, I thought, well, which mortgage-backed securities did they choose to buy? The good ones or the bad ones? And simply, there is already a detachment, in my opinion, between the fundamentals of the market and the prices which we see. Schiller PE index, for example, sitting there about 37, 38, meaning we're spending nearly $40 to get $1 of earnings, where, over the last 120 years, probably the mean's been 15, 16. So we're more than double what we're paying for cash flow, for production. GDP certainly hasn't kept pace. So I agree with you that, a bubble, and to me, a bubble is simply when you have a detachment from what fundamentals would normally suggest the value is, simply because of supply and demand of the asset. You use debt, that becomes an enabler. It empowers people to buy the stuff they normally would not been empowered to buy. So we have a debt economy, essentially. So here's my next question. If you have all of this money that's been printed and all of these assets that have been purchased, all of this money that's been borrowed from the U.S. or loaned to the U.S., all these bonds that have been bought and then resold to the Fed for cash invented out of nothing. You have all this going on. Doesn't that mean that if you have these many inflationary forces at work, man-made inflationary forces, that the natural deflationary forces are equal and opposing? If I look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet and I see its growth and power, doesn't that just give me the size of its opponent, deflationary force?
Yeah, which is more or less, again, going back to why I was able to predict the inflation for last year. I just looked at the basic fundamentals you just said. It was way before people were worried about the supply chain stuff. It was just looking at how much liquidity the Fed had pumped into the system.
Yeah.
And said, look, this is very simple math. I mean, it's got to go somewhere. I get that the banks are able to sit on more of it because the Fed pays the banks a tiny amount of interest for their reserves. But some of it's going to start coming out and hitting the economy. And there was last year's inflation. And by the way, it's going to be this year's inflation too, the way things are going. I have had to think harder than I ever have about how Fed policy is useful in the economy, because the basic idea of the Fed buys government bonds with new money, so monetizing the debt, is the way countries have done it around the world for years, but it creates inflation. Instead of charging a tax to pay for government spending, many economies around the world just let their government print money. They sell the government bonds, the new money hits the street, and there's an inflation that basically everybody pays. It's like a giant national sales tax. So there's nothing new about what the Fed just did. It's just that we don't do that. We're supposed to be an advanced economy that knows better, right? So I'll give you my analogy for how I think a well-run Federal Reserve should operate during crisis times, during the housing crisis, during COVID and things like that. Imagine the economy is a campfire or the fire in a fireplace, right? The fire runs on wood, fuel, real live, something that is creating heat and warmth and yada, yada, yada. Every once in a while, the fire starts to go out. So the Federal Reserve can be like kindling, right? They can put in a little bit of their own small chunks of wood just to keep the fire going until it takes back over and starts, burning on its own, right? Yep. But you're not supposed to run your fireplace on kindling. That can't be right. That's not sustainable. So at some point, the Fed has to stop throwing kindling into the fire and let the economy figure out where it is. Let the economy burn on its own. And that includes government spending. Is it too much? Well, who would know? The Fed bought all the bonds. It looks like it's a sustainable level of spending. I don't think it is. The housing market, come on. What are you doing pumping up housing prices and making people feel richer than they fundamentally are? Again,
and that probably
if you really
includes
think,
stocks.
That's a good idea. Just go buy Apple stock. I happen to own a lot of that. If you're going to buy stuff and make people feel better, make me feel better.
Well, but even there with stocks, you pump the stock market. Well, but you pump up 401ks and people feel rich, right?
That's right.
And they get to collect their fees off that stuff that grows. So it is an interesting time. We're speaking with Jay Prag, author of 2 books, Microeconomics Essentials, 4th edition, Understanding Economics in the News, and then also Microeconomics, Understanding Economics in the News. It's a fascinating discussion. And, we're grateful to have Jay here, here at the Cashflow Academy. We're here to help you. We also have free web classes to show you how we create passive income from stocks while carefully manage the risk. Check out the free web class now at investingwebclass.com. So we have the Fed, taking over and buying all these assets, and now they're saying we're going to create a soft landing, and we're going to get this back down to 2.5% by the end of 22. Most people, including me, were thinking, well, we'll have probably a 50 basis point jump, and probably looking at 25 basis points every time until we get the inflation down. Then we have a war in Ukraine, which tremendously deflationary. If you pop oil up, everybody that is in business either ships on a boat, plane, train, car, truck, something, or manufacturing materials or products out. I mean, it's just you're going to use oil, and now we have the Ukrainian oil. We have wheat that wheat's been through the roof because of the wheat crop that Ukraine and Russia put out. What's your take on where the war takes this? Because in my view, the war would be inflationary anyway, right? I mean, war causes supply to shrink.
Yeah, it's a little scary in a way because it's a combination of things, right? It does pop up a couple of individual prices and things that are spread throughout the entire economy, like oil, fuel. At the same time, it damages international trade. It messes up the system of economics that we were operating under in a fairly peaceful, fairly global way, which was creating a lot of value and a lot of economic activity all around the world. So sanctions and those sorts of things, we could spend a whole nother podcast talking about whether they actually work. But what we know they do is they interrupt the economic connections. And so if Russia's not allowed to help send fuel to Europe, and so Europe's going to slow down, then that'll come back to us at some point, major trading partner, and nothing good comes out of this. Let's put it, because we don't get the military spending part, which is also a little bit of a economic fraud, because you can grow your economy that way. What have you got, right? War. But we're not going to get that part. We're just going to get the negative connections from the economic disruption. So we're looking at kind of a stagflation sort of event where the economy is not going to do very well for fundamental reasons. And at the same time, the Fed is probably going to use this as I'm going to say excuse to not do what they have to do, to not start tightening and stop buying every government bond and mortgage-backed security. Inflation, if I'm reading the number correctly, the Fed's inflation number came out this morning and was at an annual rate of over 6%. Not good. No. I mean, this is the Fed's inflation, the PCE inflation measure is already one that's a little hokey because it ignores lots of things. But lots of things
that have inflation, right?
Yeah. I mean, if the PCE is up 6.5%, which is what I think I'm reading this as, then the consumer price index and the ones that we all see in the grocery stores pushing 10. Not good.
No.
So the Fed they're in a tough spot. Do they want to bow to the concerns of economic disruption that Ukraine is causing, or do their job, which is keep inflation low? Unemployment is fine. The economy has sorted itself after COVID. Their other mandate is to not create an inflationary environment. It hurts too many people.
Yeah.
They need to do their job,
What's strange is whenever they begin in 2017, 18-ish, Jerome Powell began to step back up his, the rate. And I felt like, well, he's probably reloading the magazine here. He's got no bullets in his gun at zero. So yeah, let's do that. Stock market didn't like it. Stock market did not like it. And so then he went to patience. They're not supposed to look at the stock market. That's not their mandate, but they do.
Correct.
And they went to patience for some reason. And then what was really fascinating is if you look at the timeline of, the growth of their financial statement, there's this small little taper pre-COVID, the fall of 2019. And at that point, he kind of shrugged his shoulders. It's almost like you could see a change in attitude on the whole board, where even before COVID hit, it begins to spike and they begin to go back to more accommodative policy. And then when COVID hit, they, like you say, they just, I mean, it was just unprecedented.
Yeah, they lost their mind. Yeah, they totally.
From a fiscal policy standpoint, and a government policy standpoint, it's a new world. I mean, I've heard now that we are not going to let people suffer at all. I mean, I would bet on hyperinflation before depression every time, because everyone's grandparents, told you about how awful the depression was, and you couldn't, everything was, money was so scarce. They're like, all right, we'll make money abundant. And I've even heard, I don't know if this is true. I hope it's somewhat apocryphal and came out of somewhere I can't really put my finger on, that because of the inflation, they say we need to send out checks to help people with their mortgages now, and help them with this inflation. I'm like, well, if you print more money to help with inflation, I mean, am I wrong?
Really simple stuff.
I don't have a PhD. I have a PhD in economics like you, so I'm just
but you're right. Yeah, it's fairly simple stuff. Yeah. This is one that I shouldn't probably say on a national podcast, but the Fed at some point reminds me of an addict who really should start doing treatment and getting on something that will help them, and they just can't stop themselves at this point.
You want to know what a Fed dopamine hit looks like? Just watch every time they lower rates. Watch what the stock market does, because they're getting another hit. And as a options trader and a stock investor, what's difficult for me is you can't fight that Fed. You can't fight the Fed on one hand. And at what point is that not good news to give another heroin shot to the economy? At what point is that, do I look at that and say, this is actually a bad thing? I don't know if I want to be in this game for now until we get some rehab done.
That is exactly the way to think about it. They cannot keep doing it. The market, of course, likes it. It's cheap. It's cheap liquidity.
Yeah.
It's but at some point, it can't. Low rates cannot keep coming from the Fed. The low rates from the Fed are not something that they just say. They do it by buying every bond that they can get their hands on to make rates low. But that's just pumping money into the system beyond a sustainable level. You're right. At some point, you should be worried to death about this.
Certainly, it's an unfortunate metaphor, especially for family members who deal with that type of tragedy. But it's an accurate metaphor in that it's hard for the market to know what good news looks like, because another round of heroin can't be a good thing, but it feels good, so it must be a good thing. And a withdrawal is painful, but it's probably a good thing. But it's painful, so it must be a bad thing. So trying to interpret, at what point, at what point the good is bad and the bad really is good, right? Is a hard thing to do. Tell me about this. This is not something people understand. I think they have a pretty good idea that money is basically just a credit on a ledger. We're not backed by gold. It's the MMT guys will tell you, well, this is valuable. They say we don't need to back it by anything. We can back it with our authority to throw you in jail for tax evasion. I mean, if we want to make this more valuable, we'll raise your taxes and say, pay us more. And you don't have a choice. You'll go to jail if you don't. If you have to pay us more taxes, that'll create plenty of demand for our dollar. We don't need to worry about inflation. We can just tax you higher. We can pull money out that way. Okay, fine. But what about things like the reverse repo market? That has been an interesting thing. You have member banks that they can, incentivize with a return at the bank, but a non-member bank doesn't get that. And what I thought was really interesting is when they really started pumping up the repo market, and how many money markets needed that. Did they pump the repo market, jack up its volume and push on that accelerator to put a floor on interest rates so international banks can't compete lower than that rate? Or did they do it because is there some hidden problem with the money market funds of breaking the buck?
Okay, so again, their activity in spaces like that began during the housing crisis, right?
Yep.
It began when there was no liquidity anywhere. All of the investment banks, all of the commercial banks, everybody was distressed, and companies simply had no way to finance operations. A wonderful movie, Too Big to Fail, that talks about this towards the end. The Fed doesn't have any direct way to put that kind of liquidity into the economy. That's just not. They don't have any mandate to be, making accounts receivable loans or something like that. So they looked for doors that they could legally go through to help put short-term money into the economy directly, because putting it into the banks didn't do any good when the banks were a hot mess, right? Mm-hmm. So they found things like the reverse repo market, which let them get money into the short-term economy, into the system, and helped people, again, finance day-to-day operations and those sorts of things. And it worked in the sense that we got out of the housing crisis in one piece. We survived. Mm-hmm. But it gave the Fed yet another tool that they thought they could use anytime it was necessary to do monetary policy. As I said, when the Fed says it's keeping interest rates low, they're not just saying that. They are keeping them low. They are buying things and doing things and becoming the other side of a transaction. So if it were simply government bonds, if it was back to the old days and that's all they could do, their policy is somewhat limited. They can't get money into the system as easily. Would that we were back there. But since the housing crisis, they've now buy mortgage-backed securities. They directly bailed out some companies back then, and they got into some of these short-term markets. So I agree with you that that's a fascinating space, but I try not to get too hung up on the technicalities, I guess is the best way to put it, about repo markets versus direct bond purchases versus all these other things, because to me, it's just another way. I don't want to beat up a kind of an uncomfortable analogy, but it's just another vein to shoot heroin in, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes another way for the Fed to feel and to be empowered, but it's not the way the system's supposed to work. You're supposed to be out there borrowing based on your credit worthiness, based on the economic fundamentals, based on, what your business is good at and things like that. It isn't supposed to be as easy to borrow, short-term or long-term, as the Fed has been making it for the last couple of years.
Let me, first of all, thank you so much. We're speaking with Jay Prag, and just a fantastic conversation on macroeconomics, particularly the Federal Reserve and the dollar. Let's expand it to some different things here. People, I know a lot of people who say, hey, in 1971, the dollar was no longer money now because, see, it's not backed by gold. Gold is money, and the dollar is just a representation of it. It was simply certified that you had some. And certainly I own some gold. I'm a bit of a gold bug, so that's great. But there's also a time where we said, well, these feathers are money, right? And when we went from feathers to gold, maybe they said, well, that's not money. It's the feathers that were money. And perhaps an argument could be made if we refuse to be dogmatic and we say, well, we're open to anything. Perhaps 1971 wasn't the day that the dollar was no longer money. Maybe that's the day that gold was no longer money, because I'll make the case that says, look, I'll tell you what money is. You can talk about stores of value and all the different formal definitions. Look, you go to the grocery store, how do you pay for your stuff? That's money. And that's just it. So money's changing. So look at this. The Saudis like our protection, but to a point. Now they're not as happy with what we do. The Chinese, the petrodollar and the idea of Bretton Woods ending, I think there's a lot of countries that are saying, why give the U.S. the status of being the world's reserve currency? And you mentioned that there might be less globalization, which would be very deflationary or inflationary, because if I can trade and get foreign labor, that's cheaper. So if I decide I'm not going to work with other countries, I got to get my own labor, my own raw materials. Countries are big enough to do that, but it would be inflationary if they don't work together. So speak just a moment to the changes you see in terms of China, the U.S., oil. I know this is big, and even the war. Even though you're in Ukraine, is the dollar's future going to change? Its role in the world with crypto, is it going to change?
Well, I'm glad you threw in the very last thing you said, because if you hadn't, I would have, which is crypto. It's all well and good to be the biggest, baddest economy in the world, with the economic muscle that we've got, and to have a currency which is well accepted, and nobody ever worries about it in the sense that you would a third-rate economy sort of thing. But at the end of the day, people hold currency, as you mentioned, because it's a store of value and because you can use it to buy things. Currency is not in and of itself a creator of economic value. It's the oil in the machine. It's not the fuel in the machine, right?
Yep.
If it were as easy as pump up the money supply and your economy will grow, if it were as easy as some people think, there'd be no poor countries in the world. Every country could do that.
You wouldn't have Venezuela's. You wouldn't have
Zimbabwe. You wouldn't have any of the poor countries, right? So it starts with economic fundamentals and growth and things like that. Now, the good news for me is we are still the highest value economy in the world in terms of creating true economic wealth. We're the only big country in the world that's rich. All the other big countries in the world, right? We're the third biggest country in the world. China, India, us, right?
Yeah.
China and India, as good as they have been for the last couple of years, are still way behind us in terms of per capita GDP. So we're the only big, rich country in the world because our economic system is open to success. We taxes notwithstanding, people who want to do something and make money doing it typically come here and do it.
Mm-hmm.
If you imagine that is not going to change dramatically, it's a political thing, right? Because once you start sharing the wealth a lot and things like that, then people don't want to create it in your country anymore.
Right.
I don't care what they say, they don't. But if you imagine that we're going to stay the best engine of economic growth for the foreseeable future, then the currency thing, I don't think becomes a choice between the currency of this country or that country. I think it becomes a choice between any currency and cryptocurrency.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll know when governments start being, because if I don't, you invoked the laws that require that you use the dollar for transactions and things like that, the legal tender laws, as they're called. If I don't have to do that because I can start actually buying things with these, I don't want to get into what I think of cryptocurrencies, but they're out there with these cryptocurrencies. Now you've lost a lot of power. It's literally now I can make transactions, not just buying a Tesla, but buying a head of lettuce,
right,
with something that is completely out of control of any government.
Right.
So when you see governments cracking down on those, you will know that they are afraid of the thing you said, which is the emperor has no clothes. The money isn't really worth anything except as a lubricant for a well-run economy. They need to be in control of the currency to some extent in order to create this, I don't want to say illusion, but let me say illusion, that they help keep the economy going. But the economy is the economy. The economy is people doing their jobs and working and transacting and those other things. Money's just the conduit. And if I have another conduit, people are going to say, I never needed the Fed. I just need a way to go buy a head of lettuce, right?
From a leadership standpoint, I look at the level of consumerism that we have, and it makes me think of the flip side of the emperor has no clothes, in which all these clothes have no emperor. Truly.
Again, a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, truly. I heard something bombastic the other day, and I have all types of different circles I run in, and it's just fascinating because I get all kinds of opinions. All right, tell me what happens. Vladimir Putin's been building up his gold supply since his first invasion in Crimea, right? Mm-hmm. he's got about 2,200 metric tons. I think and that's what we think he has. I mean, they're the biggest landmass in the world. They probably mined plenty on their own. Who knows? Some people are saying, well, he's using that. He built that up to fight the sanctions, and we'll just not accept his gold, and he'll have to keep it. But the other theory I've heard is let's say you're making 10 million barrels of oil a day normally, and you're only using 3 in your own country, and your friendly people won't buy or your friendly people buy some of that 10 extra 7 million barrels. But oil, in a way, is like milk. It doesn't spoil as fast as milk, but when dairy farmers can't sell their milk, they dump it out. They dump it in the field. I mean, that's it. It's a waste. Someone says, what if Vladimir Putin did something bombastic, just like, the Batman, Joker, right? Be in chaos, cause chaos. Well, he says, I'll tell you what, everyone, I'll sell you my oil at a loss leader. I'm not going to use most of it anyway. Tell you what, 1,000 barrels for an ounce of gold. Now, that's nutty. But what would that do to the gold market if he did that? What if he just said, look, it's going to go on the ground or, anyway, anyone in the world wants to give me an ounce of gold, like I'll send you 1,000 barrels of oil. What would happen?
Interesting possibility. At some point, they're big, but I'm not sure they're this big. But at some point, you worry about any entity, country, or whatever, accumulating a tremendous amount of a resource as important as gold. So cornering the market, as they used to say.
Yeah.
If they were able to trade something that they have, as you sort of said, in excess supply for something which is is scarce in the long run. In the short run, it's just the market. But in the long run, they win. They end up with a blocking percentage, I guess, a large amount of something which is fundamentally very valuable. I'll tell you
what does it do to the price? What I think is interesting is the arbitrage play it could create in gold, because now you see this going on and you say, well, how do I exploit that? And people start getting in on the gold, because that would create, I would think, a bigger demand for gold. If in other words, it would make the gold more valuable, because you could get such a great deal on oil with gold that everyone would want to get gold to take advantage of the arbitrage, right? I mean, does that put gold at $10,000 an ounce all of a sudden?
There are people who say that, right? And again, that's taking the logic that I was just saying to the end point that it may be hard to imagine, but who knows, which is that they accumulate so much gold that they kind of control the gold market.
Yeah.
And that would definitely do that. I actually think that the easier way for them to be selling their oil right now, one of their customers is China. China is very big. They always need a lot of energy. China is sitting on an awful lot of dollar reserves from their years of manipulating the exchange rate.
Interesting.
Again, it's supposed to be illegal with the sanctions and all, but if they're just selling the oil to China for dollars, and then the dollars just come out into the economy to buy stuff as dollars, not even knowing that they came from China to Russia to the economy, you can't put sanctions on dollar transactions. That's us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So having their biggest customer sitting on a giant pile of dollars probably creates another problem out there, which again might be inflationary.
The financial side of warfare is always fascinating, because you can fight Ukraine with the guns, but this war is really an East and West war of financial opportunity. I mean, even after World War II, when Britain wanted to go and mess, I think it was the Suez Canal, the U.S. said, you're not going to do that. We're tired of fighting. Get your tanks out of there, or we will crash we've got all these war bonds. We'll crash pound sterling, and they didn't. They pulled their tanks out. So this economics side of it is an interesting thing. Now, microeconomics. Let's get really micro. What do you do as an individual when you study it's very tough to get economists, especially macroeconomists, to talk about positioning as an individual. They're very articulate and everything, but when I go to this, and maybe it's an unfair question because it's outside their peer view, but sometimes I'll say, all right, what does your portfolio look like? What are you buying? What are you selling? How are you positioning yourself for a future of 6% inflation if that's what you feel is going to happen?
I actually, as a student, very much enjoyed macro, and I was, at Florida, I was tooled on the models of Keynesianism, which I kind of got over once I thought about the simple realities of how that can't possibly be. It can't be as simple as that.
Right.
And then ended up at Rochester, which was a little bit more classical and what some people call supply side. I just think of it as a little more balanced. And I didn't like micro. I didn't think micro was. I thought micro was too abstract. They had turned all of the things that I thought I understood, shopping and working and all of that, into equations and calculus and things which, I don't know about you, but I don't usually go to the grocery store and take a first derivative. I just don't do that very often, right? So when I wrote the micro book, I wanted it to be the same micro that I hated, but in terms that people would understand. And that actually let me be a very good business school economist because, again, in business school, nobody wants to see abstract models. They want to know, what does it look like out on the street?
Practicality. Yeah, they want practicality.
Yeah. So unfortunately, my portfolio advice is not going to be of any value directly. If you wanted to do what I did to have a fairly healthy portfolio, go back in time and start buying Apple stock in the 1980s, which is when I started buying it. When I look at that, now, of course, there's been ups and downs with, Steve Jobs passing away and other things. But when you look at a company like Apple and why is it the most valuable company in the history of the United States, to some extent, right? Depending on how you like to measure things, it makes a product that almost everybody likes, that you're willing to pay a premium for, right? Their margins are stunningly high. And it's gotten into services and so many other things.
They've infiltrated your life. Your life is, Apple Pay, entertainment, right? They've infiltrated a person's house.
But, and because I'm not going to disagree with what you said, as much as the government's talking about having to regulate and this, that, and the other, do you want it to go away? I mean, it works like a charm.
Absolutely not. They're fantastic.
During
I love
COVID,
Apple.
my little daughter couldn't meet my mother back in Maryland. So my, 80-something-year-old mother finally got an iPhone, and we pushed this one button called FaceTime, and she's able to effortlessly watch, my little daughter grow up. I mean, it works. It works great.
It's incredible. You bring up a good point here because, it's incredible the anti-capitalist. Capitalism's evil, man. Haven't you been paying attention? Look around. People can't, look how rich these people are getting. I say, you know how hard it is to build 300 million iPads and then put 300 million iPads around the world? You know how hard that is? Is it okay if Steve Jobs makes a couple bucks doing that? Because I'll tell you what, I think everyone's standard of living gets better because of that guy. I think capitalism is awesome. I'm a capitalist through and through, but I'll tell you, I'm hated by some people who say, no, capitalists are evil. All they want is greed and money. Well, whoa. They produce a lot of cool stuff that make our lives pretty cool, right?
Well, again, I'm like you. I understand where it goes awry when you manipulate a market, when you take advantage of things. I understand that, but that isn't usually the case. The people that got very wealthy in our generation created products that have become the cornerstones of our economy, right? Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and others, and they're not all people I like personally.
Sure.
But they created things that we now consider necessities. And oh, by the way, where would we have been during lockdown had we not had an Amazon who had shown the world how to home deliver practically anything, within 24 hours. It's just shocking to think about where we would have been had we not had all of those innovations and innovators. I don't understand the capitalism is bad thing, except for the way I always like to tell students is this: you need to get around more. You need to go visit countries where it isn't capitalist. Go to Cuba, go to Venezuela, and show me their smartphone market.
Even talk to people that have been there. If you can't get there, I had dinner with a guy that he fled Venezuela, and it was one of the most sobering dinners I'd ever had because he was on the ground when Chavez was, doing all this government-free stuff, government-free gas, government. And he said, he told me what happened, and it was chilling. Chilling.
Yeah. And again, there are other bigger countries that are still a little too socialist for me. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I get that there are times when you feel like you need to rearrange how things used to be, and maybe you go by way of something that looks a little more socialist or communist or whatever you want to call it. But the true wealth in the world's economy has come from capitalism, from the reallocation of money from bad projects to good projects, from something which used to work and doesn't anymore, and then into something that's bigger and better. The famous closing speech in Other People's Money is one that I tell students all the time. Businesses have their day, and then they're gone, and you need to reallocate resources. You don't want the government making choices about that, because the government's mandates are for getting reelected, being liked. Money doesn't care if it's liked. Money wants to grow, period. End of story. Right? I like capitalism.
You've been so gracious with your time. I'm going to push my luck and go with a couple of quick questions so we can just hit them and get more in. Modern monetary theory. Go.
I haven't seen any aspect of it that convinces me that the old well-worn beliefs about excess money creates inflation. I haven't seen anything that changes my mind about that. I think modern monetary theory is a modern myth, frankly.
Okay. Are we doing it? Are we trying to do it? I feel like that's our theory. I feel like that's what we're going with.
We absolutely are. It is a version of the Fed has ways to directly grow the economy, change people's lives, become a social activist, and all these other things. And it's misunderstanding what money is in the economy. It really is. We are sort of kind of doing it. It's not going to work.
I didn't watch.
The economy's fundamentals are the economy's fundamentals.
They are. I didn't watch Biden's address. I had a family night with my kids instead, but I saw a clip from it later on where he talked about all the stuff we're going to build and all this stuff, we're going to redo the infrastructure. And, they sell, like you mentioned, they sell a better society, basically. The sales pitch is we're going to have a better society. But I would tell anyone before they drink that Kool-Aid, just Google Warren Mosler, who's kind of the father of this. And he says, look, the reason it works is simple. I have all of you in a room. You can't leave until you get one of my business cards. They say, well, your business cards are worthless. He says, yeah, but I got Guido out in the hall, and if you don't take one of my business cards, he's going to shoot you. That's literally that's his metaphor. I feel much better about our heroin metaphor now. Much better about that one, because that's his.
Yeah, me too.
And to me, that's about as authoritarian freedom removing as you get. I mean, that is authoritarian stuff. So that's MMT. Talk about this. Crypto. People think Bitcoin, I have some Bitcoin, but I'm very measured in my enthusiasm for Bitcoin simply because of this. I think Bitcoin will someday be a lot like maybe, remember WordPerfect, the word processor, WordPerfect and Quattro Pro and the first.
I do. I talk about them all the time.
Yeah. Well, that was word processing, right? And remember the 4.5-inch floppy. Look at all the data I can put on this 4.5-inch floppy. I mean, it's amazing. Now we got 3.5-inch floppy. That's Ethereum, right? Amazing. The fact of the matter is, technology gets better, and anytime the technology has a flaw, someone's going to be building a better mousetrap. When you look at the blockchain network and the amount of computing power that it has to have to grow and verify and re-verify and get new blocks, that carbon footprint is going to be a big deal. In a world that cares about carbon footprints, I think someone's going to figure out a way to take all the good stuff that the blockchain brings, But if they can figure out a way to do it with reducing a carbon footprint, Bitcoin's done the next day. It's done the next day. So I don't know if I believe that crypto is, I wouldn't say that it's not the future. I think it's a step towards the future, but I think it's such an infancy, right? I mean, a hypertext transfer protocol. Well, Netscape, there you go. Netscape is now how you browse the web. I mean, Netscape is it. Well, the protocol didn't change, but the technology and how we use the protocol changed. That's my feeling. I think the obsolescence risk of crypto is way high. That's pretty weird to say when most people don't even know what it is yet. They could be obsolete that fast. Any thoughts on that?
I agree. I agree with every single word you said. I don't own any. If I could have gotten in way long time ago and bought it basically just, on spec, I might have. But it isn't in and of itself creating any value, right? It's only real value is the ability to evade the governmental authorities that run the rest of the system, the money supply and taxation and things like that, and the fact that it can't be counterfeited, right? So it's uniqueness and all of that. But as you pointed out, that comes at an enormous price technologically. At some point, it gets ridiculously expensive to maintain that can't be counterfeited part of the process. And one does wonder whether that component of it has the value that people appear to be willing to pay for it. Many people that I know who are younger than me, but are fundamental investors, use words for this space that are like Ponzi scheme type stuff.
Yeah.
Not in the worst sense, because there's certainly, like you said, there's technological value there. There's something there that is new.
It's beautiful.
Is it worth what you're paying for it? And, I agree. I think this is the first step towards something that might change how we do things like accounting or, how
about voting?
Ledger-based stuff.
How about voting?
That would be interesting. That would solve a lot of people's problems, right? I like everybody. I want everybody who wants to vote to be able to vote. I just don't want somebody else voting for you.
Yeah.
I don't want the same person voting 55 times because they were able to get 55 ballots at a party somewhere, right?
Crazy.
So, that would be fine with me. But I don't personally invest in crypto.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't create.
It's like gold. It doesn't create anything. It's a capital gain investment. There's no cash flow in it. It's a hedge.
That's correct.
It's a hedge. It's protection. When I buy my crypto, it's for hedge. And speaking of that, my parents my grandpa was a World War II type guy, and that dropped into a little bit of my parents. And so when I was a kid, we worked in the garden. We had a big garden, right? We went and hoe the peas and eat the fresh carrots and potatoes and everything. Mm-hmm. And we would can stuff. We would they call it putting it up. We're going to put up some jam or put up some peaches or put up some, fruit or whatever, pickle some whatever. And so all those smells were in the kitchen growing up. And they always were preparing for what they call hard times. They go, what are we doing? They go, we're preparing for hard times, which is basically a reference to the Depression. They lived through that. Well, if you're in Russia and you lived through the first Cold War, I can't believe I'm saying that, the first Cold War, you probably have some of that. And let's say let's take the average American. Let's say the average American has less than $400 in the bank savings, but let's say they have 10 times that in debt. Let's say they've got, 40 grand in debt. Isn't the crushing of the ruble the coolest thing that ever happened to those consumers over there? It's like, my debt just got wiped out. This is awesome. And I got potatoes in my cellar because I'm used to living in Russia and I don't like bread lines.
I like that. I'll be honest. I hadn't thought of that particular step in the process, but I do like the logic there. I do think there's a lot to that. I do think Russians and Russia were pretty prepared for what was going to come at them when they started this invasion. They had ways to sell their oil. They have resources that are set aside. I'm sure that the economic sanctions have had an impact, but I believe, like what you said, they're going to be getting through this okay for quite a little while. But again, I hadn't really thought of the potatoes in the cellar and you just wiped out my debt. I think that is right.
So I look at that as a model. I look at my family, and I say to myself, okay, well, I can't eat my gold, but if I have a nice store of food for a while, and let's say the Fed says, look, we want to have at least 2% inflation. Okay, what's 2% inflation over a 30-year mortgage? If a person could buy a piece of real estate, I don't think it's even stocks right now. So I think stocks are in a place where they would be more bubbled. Real estate might be bubbled, but your debt, if we hyperinflate, I think the best investment a person could possibly make is debt, because you can borrow it instead of earning it, and it just vaporizes with big inflation. And that's the opposite of what I read in most financial literacy books. They say, look, save money, stay out of debt. Well, if the Fed's going to do what they're going to do, get rid of your savings because it's going to be destroyed, go into debt as fast as you can with an asset like a house. If the renter's paying the mortgage so you can service this debt, why wouldn't you want to do that as fast as you possibly could? If you believe in hyperinflation, all your houses are going to come for free.
Last year. Again, when mortgage rates, because the Fed, not only what you just said, but the Fed was literally buying mortgages, right?
Yeah.
So they were keeping mortgage rates at long-term fixed at 2%. Yeah, hence the housing boom bubble.
Enabling people to buy
the
that
Fed did a real good job there, making sure that no middle-class person will ever buy another house in the United States. So from the investor side, everybody was, Zillow did it. All of the loose money that was out there with nothing better to do just bought houses and created a really interesting, an easy investment. As you said, borrow at 2, you're going to make money over the life of that. But when rates normalize, if you're talking instead about 30-year fixed at 7, and people say, well, it'll never be there. Well, my first mortgage was at 7. I'm not that old. It could be back there. That's a slightly different thing. That's getting a little closer to break even, a little closer to a risky investment. But if you can borrow long term at 2% and buy houses, buy them all. Buy everything you can get your hands on. And I have many students who did that, and I think that was a wonderful idea.
I've tried to be smart and stay apolitical as a teacher and as an education advocate, because as soon as you talk about politics and religion, people are just going to start to hate each other and maybe even hate you. And I don't like people to hate me. I guess some do. But read Microeconomics Essentials and also read Macroeconomics Essentials. And I love the title of your books, particularly the word essentials. The word essential doesn't denote this is maybe helpful, or maybe this, it would be nice if we understood this. Money affects everyone in the electorates of the world. Money does. And when the electorate shapes economic policy via, politics, hence the word policy, an uneducated electorate, to me, is dangerous. If you're going to be a socialist, if you're going to move from capitalist to socialist, well, do it having studied. Because what I find is most of the people that start off going down the road of Keynesian economics, many, many, many of them come around, unless they're a politician, they come around, they say, you know what, that was an interesting theory. We can see how it might be theoretical, but from a practicality standpoint, you got to have some GDP. You got to go out of work. You got to go produce stuff, and the people that work harder are going to have a bigger bank account than the people that don't. And we don't have equality. Well, you know what? You can go on Cockeyed Con Academy and learn how to do open heart surgery nowadays. I swear, there's nothing you could not learn in this world. So I think the word essentials is a real important reason to go out. You've had the chance to listen to Jay speak for an hour or so. And I imagine that you get the feeling, as I do, that I could spend an entire evening, by the fire table with Jay, and we would just love the conversation. So if you'd like to continue that, go get his books. You can get it, Kindle, paperback, whatever you want. And imagine, I do my very best to sell books, because I know the more people that read them, the smarter we'll become and the better decisions we can make in a very difficult time. And so if you picked up the tab, you take Jay out for dinner and drinks, you picked up the tab for a couple $100 and you got to bend his ear for a while, man, you can get a lot more you don't have to take him out to dinner for much less. You can go to Amazon.com. You can invest in yourself, because that's all an investment in a book is an invest in your own mind. and pick up his books, Microeconomic Essentials and Macroeconomics Essentials, Understanding the Economics in the News. What a delightful, I could talk to you all day. You can tell I'm a little loquacious, Jay, because, well, I don't get to talk a lot of, there's not a lot of people I know, after I leave podcast and I go out and, have dinner or whatever, there's not a lot of people who want to talk about this stuff. So, and I get a little intimidated. I don't have a PhD at all. So this is the closest I'll get to be able to take one of your classes. I don't think they'd admit me.
Well, thank you very much. And the PhD is really not a very important part of it. If economics doesn't make common sense to you when you hear it, then it's probably wrong. That's the way I teach this. Or as the guy that my business school is named after, Peter Drucker, who took classes from Keynes and hated them, said, if it doesn't resonate with the people in terms of your choices and things like that, if you've abstracted your economics to where you can't even see people anymore there, then it's probably wrong. So, yeah, I like talking economics with people who just like, sharing thoughts and thinking about common sense.
It's a reduction, any policy that reduces freedom is going to struggle long term. And any policy that de-incentivizes innovation, production, working hard, competition, my common sense is probably not going to fly. Thank you so much. Let's say someone's listening to this. Let's finish on this one. Someone's listening and there's like, wow, okay, sounds to me like what these guys have said. We should buckle up maybe for some more inflation, that this heroin addict, maybe the Fed takes some measures, but they'll probably be half measures. And I just bet on inflation, even though there's massive deflationary forces out there, war, COVID problems, supply chains, globalization, all that stuff's inflation or deflationary. They seem to have, tied their wagon to the inflation horse. Any advice for those guys moving forward over the next, 6 months? Is there anything you would do to say, hey, here's something you might put your house in order, or something you might work to learn over the next 6 months? Well,
here's where being me gets a little scary. I don't have a good recommendation. I love giving free advice, but inflation is just one of those things that finds you out there. It's everywhere. I'm the shopper in my family, and I go to stores for years and years, and I look at prices of things that I've been buying, forever, and I think, in what world do I want to pay $8 for a pound of hot dogs? You've got to be kidding. Inflation, the traditional hedges you mentioned, gold, because gold tends to go up with inflation, commodities, things like that, but a little late to the game for a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Inflation is sadly just a really difficult thing to do a workaround on. I don't think the Fed is going to completely lose its mind and keep doing what it's been doing. I would prepare for higher rates. I think it's going to hit everything that interest rates hit. So the stock market, the housing market. People say the housing market is supported by a lack of inventory. But let's see how that works out at, again, 7% mortgages.
Yeah.
I think we're in for higher rates. And I don't like stagflation. I don't like the idea that we're going to have inflation and a slowdown in the economy at the same time. It's very painful. The last time we had it was just an economic disaster. And if you don't believe that, text Jimmy Carter, ask him how he feels about the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're in for a really interesting, somewhat rough year in terms of, economics.
We can't thank you enough, Jay Prag, for your time, your expertise, and particularly, when I open the show, I'm really serious. Is what we try to do is make financial education simple, and your use of metaphor, you can tell you're a great teacher, and that you care about not just like some teachers want to speak in a way so everyone knows how smart they are. Other teachers care about the communication. Are they understanding? And genius is simplification. It's not to complicate things. So we thank you for that expertise. Andy Tanner, this is the Cashflow Academy podcast, and just a resource. Here at the Cashflow Academy show, our goal is to help you grow your financial knowledge. If you want to see how to put your own investing education into action, we have a valuable web class that shows you how to create passive income from stocks. Check out this free web class now at investingwebclass.com. You'll see how to generate cash flow and manage risk every step of the way. And I really think you'll enjoy this eye-opening presentation. So get to this web class now at investingwebclass.com. And also go to amazon.com at a minimum. Check out these books, Peter Kennedy, Jay Prag, Micro Essentials, Macro Essentials. This helps you understand economics in the news. With that, we wish you well, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.